In 1405, a fleet of 317 ships sailed from China, the largest armada the world had ever seen. Then it vanished.
Chapter 1: The Emperor's Grand Design. The Ming Dynasty that Zhu Yuanzhang founded in 1368 was built on a paradox that would define Chinese history for the next century. A civilization of extraordinary sophistication and organizational power that had chosen, by deliberate policy, to turn its face away from the sea. The Hongwu Emperor, who had led the rebellion that expelled the Mongol Yuan dynasty after nearly a century of foreign rule, was a man of peasant origins and profound suspicion of the coastal merchant class, whose wealth and foreign connections he associated with the disorder of the previous era. He established the Hai Jin, the maritime prohibition that banned Chinese subjects from building large ocean-going vessels or conducting private foreign trade, concentrating the empire's enormous productive capacity inward toward the recovery of the agricultural heartland that the Mongol period had disrupted. The founding logic of the early Ming was self-sufficiency, agrarian order, and the reassertion of the Confucian hierarchy, in which scholar officials governed, peasants farmed, merchants occupied their proper subordinate place, and the ocean was a frontier to be guarded rather than a highway to be exploited. Nanjing, the southern capital where the Hongwu Emperor ruled, was magnificently walled, its circuit of walls the longest in the world, and magnificently focused on the land. The great Yangtze River flowing past it carried the rice and silk and cotton of the Jiangnan heartland that made China the wealthiest agricultural civilization on Earth. What lay beyond the horizon to the southeast, the trading networks of the South China Sea, the vast commerce of the Indian Ocean, the Hongwu Emperor regarded as a distraction from the serious work of rebuilding a Chinese civilization that the Mongols had disrupted, and that only restored Confucian order could properly reconstitute.
The civil war that erupted after the Hongwu Emperor's death in 1398 was, in retrospect, the event that made Zheng He's voyages possible, not despite the violence of the succession struggle, but because of it. The Zhenwen Emperor, who inherited the throne as the Hongwu Emperor's chosen successor, was a young and scholarly man who immediately set about reducing the power of the imperial princes who governed the outlying regions of the empire, a policy that threatened the security and autonomy of his uncle, Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, who governed the northern frontier region around Beijing with a powerful military force hardened by decades of border warfare against the Mongol remnants north of the Great Wall. Zhu Di's response was to launch what he called the Jingnan Campaign, the pacification of the realm, a civil war that the official record would later characterize as a military intervention to rescue the dynasty from bad advisors rather than a rebellion against a legitimate emperor. The campaign lasted 3 years. In 1402, Zhu Di's armies stormed Nanjing. The Zhenwen Emperor disappeared in the burning of the palace. His body was never definitively identified, and Zhu Di ascended the throne as the Yongle Emperor, the ruler of perpetual happiness. The new emperor was everything his predecessor was not, a military commander of genuine ability and relentless ambition, a man who had spent his formative decades on the northern frontier, facing the reality of a world that extended far beyond the Confucian agricultural ideal, and a man with a specific personal agenda that required demonstrating to the entire Chinese world and beyond it that his seizure of power was not merely successful, but cosmically legitimate. The voyages would serve that demonstration.
The Yongle Emperor moved the imperial capital from Nanjing to Beijing, a decision of enormous symbolic and practical consequence, placing the dynasty's center of gravity at the northern frontier, where his own military power was rooted, rather than in the Confucian cultural heartland, where his legitimacy was most contested. He commissioned the Forbidden City, whose construction employed 1 million workers over 15 years and produced the largest palace complex ever built, its immense courtyards and vermilion halls designed to overwhelm visitors with the physical demonstration of imperial power. He sponsored the compilation of the Yongle Da Dian, an encyclopedia of 22,000 volumes that attempted to collect all existing Chinese knowledge into a single imperially organized corpus, the largest encyclopedia in the world at the time. He sent military expeditions into Vietnam, reasserting Chinese suzerainty over a territory that had slipped away during the Mongol period. And he launched the treasure fleet voyages, the Baochuan Heng Hai, the sailing of the great ships, as the maritime component of a comprehensive program to project Chinese power, prestige, and legitimacy to every corner of the known world. The voyages were not, in the emperor's conception, merchant ventures. China did not need anything the outer world had to offer, in the way that European trade was driven by scarcity. China had silk and porcelain and everything else. What the Yongle emperor sought from the voyages was tribute, the formal acknowledgement by foreign rulers that they occupied a subordinate position in a world order centered on the Ming throne, sending envoys and gifts to Beijing in recognition of Chinese suzerainty. The treasure ships were not merchant vessels, they were statements. The question of why the Yongle emperor chose a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan to command this immense enterprise reveals the specific political logic of the court in which Zheng He had made his career. The eunuch system, the institution of castrated men serving in the imperial household, was one of the defining features of Chinese imperial government and one of its most contested. Eunuchs occupied an anomalous position in the Confucian social order, outside the regular family structure that gave men their social identity, outside the scholar-official examination hierarchy that was supposed to supply the empire's governance, dependent entirely on imperial favor for their status and survival. This marginality made them, from the emperor's perspective, uniquely trustworthy. A eunuch had no family to be loyal to, no scholarly lineage to represent, no independent career path that could survive without imperial patronage. The Yongle emperor trusted his eunuchs with his most sensitive missions, precisely because they were entirely his creatures, in a way that Confucian officials, with their competing loyalties to family, scholarly tradition, and abstract principle, could never be. Zheng He was the most trusted of these trusted men, the eunuch who had fought beside Zhu Di in the Jingnan Civil War with a distinction that had been rewarded with the highest honors the emperor could bestow. His Muslim background, he was born Ma He of a Yunnan family that had made the Hajj to Mecca, was not an embarrassment but a practical asset. The most important trading ports of the Indian Ocean world were Islamic, and an admiral with cultural fluency in Arabic and Persian and the protocols of Islamic court etiquette would find doors open that would remain closed to a man of purely Chinese formation.
The political opposition to the voyages was present from the beginning and would prove in the end fatal. The Confucian scholar official class, the Jinshi graduates of the imperial examination system who staffed the ministries and provincial governments of the Ming bureaucracy, had deep ideological objections to everything the voyages represented.
Commerce was, in the Confucian hierarchy of occupations, below agriculture and craft, something practiced by an inferior social class whose pursuit of profit was inherently corrupting to the social order. The voyages, whatever the emperor called them, involved the Chinese state in the business of foreign trade on a massive scale, enriched the eunuch officials who organized them at the expense of the scholar official class whose proper role was governance, and elevated precisely the wrong kind of people, eunuchs, merchants, sailors, interpreters, to positions of imperial favor and responsibility. The literati argued, with the quiet persistence of a class that knew its arguments would eventually prevail, that the voyages were extravagant wastes of imperial resources that could more productively be spent on the northern frontier defense against the Mongol remnants who perpetually threatened China's land borders, that foreign contact would introduce corrupting influences into a social order that needed protection rather than exposure, and that the entire enterprise of seeking tribute from distant barbarian rulers was beneath the dignity of a civilization that had nothing to learn from the outer world. These arguments would ultimately win, but they would take 3 decades to win, and in those 3 decades the treasure ships would sail the Indian Ocean in a manner that has no parallel in the history of maritime exploration.
The Longjiang shipyard at Nanjing, where the treasure ships were constructed, was one of the greatest industrial enterprises of the pre-modern world, a complex of dry docks, warehouses, workshops, and administrative facilities stretching along the southern bank of the Yangtze River that at its height employed tens of thousands of workers in the specialized trades of large vessel construction. The site's archaeological remnants, including enormous timber rudder posts recovered in modern excavations, confirm the scale of what was built here. Vessels whose dimensions the surviving records describe as 440 chi in length by 180 chi in beam, roughly 137 meters long and 56 meters wide, 9-masted with 4 decks, capable of carrying hundreds of soldiers, sailors, doctors, astrologers, craftsmen, and diplomats in conditions that were, by the standards of the time, relatively comfortable. The ships were built with watertight compartments, a Chinese technological innovation that did not reach European shipbuilding for centuries, and carried navigational equipment that included the magnetic compass, a Chinese invention in use for maritime navigation since the 11th century. The Mao Kun map, derived from the voyage's navigational records and preserved in a later military treatise, charts the routes from China to East Africa in a strip map form that demonstrates the sophistication of the Chinese navigational tradition. Coastlines, headlands, distances, depths, and star-bearing guides recorded with the precision of an established and practiced maritime tradition. These were not explorers groping into the unknown. They were the heirs of centuries of organized Chinese commerce in the South China Sea, scaling up to an entirely new order of magnitude. The First Fleet assembled at Liujiagang near the mouth of the Yangtze in the summer of 1405, and its scale, even described in the laconic terms of the imperial records, defies easy comprehension. 317 ships, 27,800 men. The ships were organized into specialized categories: the great treasure ships for the diplomatic cargo and the admiral's flag, horse ships carrying the tribute animals that would be distributed among allied rulers, supply ships loaded with provisions for months at sea, water tankers carrying fresh water for the long ocean crossings, troop transports, and warships for security. The fleet was, in effect,
a self-sufficient floating city capable of months of independent operation, carrying its own medical staff and its own agricultural capacity in the form of vegetables grown on the upper decks during long passages. No subsequent navy in any civilization assembled anything of comparable scale or organizational sophistication for another 5 centuries. The Portuguese fleets that would reach the same Indian Ocean ports within a generation of the last treasure voyage carried crews of 100 or 200 men in vessels a fraction of the size of the smallest ships in Zheng He's fleet. The contrast is so extreme that it has seemed to some historians almost impossible to reconcile with the subsequent reversal of fortune. How did the civilization that built these ships end up banned from the ocean, while the civilization of the small wooden caravels ended up dominating it? The answer is not in the ships. It is in the politics of the courts that sent them and eventually recalled them.
The summer of 1405 marked the departure of the first treasure voyage, and July 11 of that year, commemorated in modern China as Maritime Day, saw Zheng He's fleet begin its southward passage along the Chinese coast toward the open ocean. The admiral himself, at approximately 34 years of age, was a man of commanding physical presence by every account that survives, purportedly over 6 feet tall, a stature unusual enough in any population of the era to be remarked upon consistently by contemporary observers, with the broad build and deliberate bearing of a military commander who had spent his formative years on campaign in the Yunnan Civil War. He was a practiced organizer and a man of religious faith. His Muslim practice, maintained discreetly within the Chinese imperial system, would prove practically useful at every Islamic port the fleet visited, and personally meaningful throughout his life. The Tianfei Palace on the Fujian coast, dedicated to the goddess of the sea who protected sailors, received his prayers and his offerings before every voyage. He inscribed her praises on stone tablets that survive as some of the most important physical artifacts of the voyages. He was, in everything the sources reveal about him, a man of genuine competence and genuine piety, qualities that complemented each other rather than conflicting, as they do in the best leaders of any tradition. The ocean ahead, as the fleet cleared the Chinese coast and the monsoon winds filled the great battened sails of the treasure ships, was not unknown. It was the highway of a trading world that Chinese merchants had navigated for centuries. What was new was the scale of the state's commitment to that world and the ambition of what it intended to accomplish there. The tribute system that the Yongle Emperor intended the voyages to extend was a specifically Chinese institution with no precise equivalent in the political vocabulary of any other civilization. Under the tribute system, foreign rulers acknowledged the Chinese emperor's theoretical suzerainty by sending periodic missions to Beijing, carrying symbolic gifts, exotic animals, rare products, tribute in the technical sense, and receiving in return imperial recognition, Chinese gifts of considerably greater value than the tribute itself, and the right to trade within the Chinese imperial market under favorable conditions. The system was, in practical terms, a sophisticated form of soft power diplomacy. The Chinese emperor gained face and the ideological confirmation of his universal sovereignty. The foreign ruler gained legitimacy, commercial access, and Chinese protection against rivals, and both parties gained the trade flows that the ritual exchange authorized. The first voyages focused on establishing this system across the established trading ports of Southeast Asia and the Western Indian Ocean: Champa in Vietnam, Java, Malacca, Calicut in India.
Malacca, a small and newly founded Malay sultanate, threatened by Siamese pressure from the north, eagerly entered the tribute system and received Chinese protection that transformed it into the dominant commercial entrepot of Southeast Asian trade for the next century, the single most consequential diplomatic result of the first voyage, and a demonstration of the system's genuine effectiveness. The relationship between China and Malacca, created by Zheng He's first voyage, would shape the commercial geography of the South China Sea for generations.
The pirate Chen Yi controlled the Malacca Strait in 1405 with the confident presumption of a man who had been preying on the merchant traffic of the world's most important commercial choke point for long enough to consider it his private revenue stream. When Zheng He's fleet arrived in the strait, Chen Yi initially offered to submit to the Chinese authority, an offer that concealed, according to the Chinese records, a plan to attack the fleet at anchor and plunder its enormous cargo. Whether the intelligence that revealed this plan was the product of espionage or accident, Zheng He acted on it. The battle that followed was brief and conclusive. The pirate fleet was defeated, 5,000 pirates killed, 10 vessels destroyed. Chen Yi was captured and transported back to Nanjing, where he was executed. The message the battle sent to every port and every pirate and every doubtful ruler in the Indian Ocean world was not subtle. The Chinese fleet was not merely a diplomatic mission with pretty ships and expensive gifts. It was a naval force of overwhelming capability, willing to use that capability, and the tributaries it sought were expected to maintain conditions of commercial order in their waters or face the consequences. The combination of extraordinary generosity toward cooperative rulers and demonstrated willingness to destroy uncooperative ones was not accidental. It was the policy, repeated consistently across all 7 voyages, that made the tribute system work. Zheng He was a diplomat with a navy. That sequence, diplomat first, navy second, was what distinguished the Chinese approach from the Portuguese approach that would follow it into the same waters. The difference mattered enormously for the civilizations the Chinese encountered, at least while the Chinese were there to enforce it.
Chapter 2. The Admiral from Yunnan.
The province of Yunnan, in the southwestern corner of China, where Ma He was born around 1371, was one of the most culturally complex territories in the Ming Empire, a mountainous borderland where Chinese, Tibetan, Burmese, Dai, and various other peoples coexisted in a layered ecology of different agricultural and pastoral economies, and where the Muslim communities established during the Mongol Yuan period had taken deep root among the local population. Ma He's family belonged to these Yunnan Muslims. His father bore the honorific title Haji, indicating that he had made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and his grandfather bore the same title, a family of genuine Islamic piety with the financial means and physical courage to undertake the overland journey from Yunnan to Arabia and back in an era when such a journey represented months of travel through multiple political jurisdictions and landscapes of genuine danger. The family's Muslim faith was practiced in the context of Chinese cultural norms. They spoke Chinese, wrote in Chinese, operated within the social structures of Chinese provincial society, and maintained their Islamic practice, prayer, dietary laws, the Hajj, as the spiritual and communal framework of a minority identity that did not prevent full participation in the broader Chinese world. Young Ma He grew up bilingual in Chinese and Arabic, fluent in the Islamic scholarly tradition and equally at home in the Confucian cultural environment of his province, a formation that would prove decisive for his later career. He was, from childhood, a man who could operate in multiple cultural registers simultaneously, a quality that the treasure fleet voyages would require in its admiral above all others. The Ming conquest of Yunnan in 1382, when Ma He was approximately 10 years old, shattered this formation violently and permanently. The Ming army, asserting imperial control over the last territory held by Mongol-affiliated forces in China, conquered the province with the organized brutality of military campaigns that had no patience for civilian distinctions. The young Ma He was among the males captured and castrated in the aftermath of the conquest, a standard practice by which conquered populations were demobilized and the most promising of their sons converted into eunuch servants of the imperial household. He was taken north, given to the household of Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, and entered a world whose rules and hierarchies he would have to master quickly if he was to survive, let alone prosper within them.
The household of Zhu Di, Prince of Yan, was, in the 1380s and 1390s, the training ground for a generation of military and administrative talent that would eventually reshape the Ming Empire. The prince governed the northern frontier region around Beijing from his base at Beiping, the city that would become the imperial capital under his reign, and the practical demands of frontier governance gave his household a different character from the more ceremonially focused households of the other imperial princes. Real military campaigns against Mongol raiders north of the Wall, real administrative challenges of managing a complex frontier population, real decisions about logistics and supply and the deployment of force. These were the conditions in which the young Ma He learned his trade. He rose rapidly in the prince's service, demonstrating the organizational intelligence and physical courage that were apparently inherent in his character from the beginning. By the time of the Yunnan Civil War, he was not merely a household servant, but a trusted military commander, leading troops in the field beside the prince and distinguishing himself in battles whose tactical demands required genuine military judgment. The campaign lasted 3 years, from 1399 to 1402. Ma He was present at its critical engagements, the crossing of the Yellow River, the siege of Jinan, the final assault on Nanjing, and when Zhu Di ascended the throne as the young Lei emperor, he rewarded Ma He with a new surname, Zhen, taken from the location of one of the campaign's decisive battles. The three-gem eunuch, Sanbao Taijian, was the honorific by which the ports of the Indian Ocean would come to know him, the great admiral, tall and commanding, wearing the formal robes of the highest court rank, carrying the emperor's commission and the emperor's authority in every harbor he entered. From a captured boy in a provincial conquest to the commander of the world's greatest fleet, the trajectory was extraordinary by any standard, made possible by a combination of genuine ability and the specific logic of an imperial system that elevated eunuchs precisely because their elevation depended entirely on imperial will.
The practical organization that Zheng He brought to the treasure voyages reflected a systematic intelligence that is visible in every surviving record of the expeditions. He did not merely command the fleet in the sense of giving tactical orders. He designed the entire operational framework with a thoroughness and foresight that anticipated virtually every contingency a sustained ocean campaign across the breadth of the Indian Ocean could present. The fleet was organized in a sophisticated hierarchy of command that placed specialized officers over each category of vessel: treasure ships, horse ships, supply ships, water tankers, troop transports, with clear chains of accountability running through the fleet's senior deputy commanders, eunuch officials of high rank like Wang Jinghong and Hong Bao, who managed diplomatic protocols in a dozen different courts and whose names appear alongside Zheng He's in the stone inscriptions and official documents of the voyages, down to the individual ship captains and their crews of hundreds of sailors,
soldiers and specialists. The provisions planning was meticulous to a degree that no other navy of the era attempted. The fleet carried not merely the preserved salt fish, grain, and bean paste of the standard military provisioning system, but live animals for slaughter en route, seeds and soil for the shipboard vegetable gardens tended on the upper decks of the large vessels, and the herbal medicines, including fresh ginger and green vegetables, that prevented the vitamin C deficiency disease, scurvy, that would devastate European long voyage crews for another century and a half until James Cook's voyages of the 1770s finally incorporated the lesson that fresh plant matter was the specific prevention. The medical staff carried the full pharmacopoeia of traditional Chinese medicine adapted to the specific diseases of the tropical ocean environment, including the malaria and dysentery that were the great killers of any army that spent time in the Indian Ocean's port cities and river deltas. The diplomatic preparation was equally thorough and equally systematic. Letters from the Yongle Emperor to specific foreign rulers were drafted in advance in multiple languages by the court's translation bureau. Interpreters capable of literary Arabic, conversational Persian, Tamil, various Swahili dialects, Malay, Javanese, and the languages of the Vietnamese and Siamese courts were recruited from the Chinese Muslim communities of the coastal provinces where such multilingual competence was available. And the cargo of diplomatic gifts, silk graded in 37 quality levels, porcelain sorted by type and value, bronze goods, gold and silver, was selected, inventoried, and loaded with attention to the specific status and known preferences of the rulers who would receive it at each port. Zheng He was not an improviser, he was a planner of the first order, and the 7 voyages' consistent achievement of their diplomatic objectives across 30 years, the enrollment of more than 30 tributary states, the maintenance of commercial order across the Indian Ocean, the safe return of fleet and crew across thousands of miles of open water, was the product of institutional planning of a quality that no other naval commander of the pre-modern era could have approached. The religious dimension of Zheng He's identity, the Muslim faith maintained with genuine personal devotion within the structures of a Buddhist and Confucian Chinese imperial court, was not a private matter separate from the public conduct of the voyages, but a central practical element of their remarkable diplomatic success. The most commercially significant civilizations of the Indian Ocean world in the early 15th century were Islamic, the Arab trading cities of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf from Aden to Hormuz, the Muslim sultanates of the Malabar coast of India, including the powerful Zamorin of Calicut, who presided over the world's most important pepper trade, the emerging and increasingly confident Islamic states of maritime Southeast Asia, including the Malacca Sultanate, whose commercial network was rapidly expanding across the archipelago, and the Swahili trading city-states of the East African coast, from Mogadishu to Mombasa, whose merchant class was organized around the same Indian Ocean Muslim commercial network. An admiral who could speak literary Arabic and conversational Persian, who knew instinctively the protocols of Islamic court hospitality, from the initial exchange of greetings to the conduct of the formal meal to the appropriate gifts for the host's household, who understood the Quran and the principal hadith collections and the etiquette of dealing with qadis and imams and Muslim rulers in the specific register of respectful address that Islamic scholarly culture demanded, who was, in short, a Muslim of genuine formation and sincere practice, would find a quality of welcome and trust in these ports that a non-Muslim Chinese official of equal rank and superior fleet could not have achieved, because trust in the Indian Ocean's Muslim commercial culture was partly a matter of shared sacred identity and its associated protocols of honest dealing. Zheng He's Muslim practice was not concealed at the Chinese court or treated as an awkwardness requiring management. The young Le emperor, who had grown up surrounded by Muslim advisors and frontier military commanders from the northwestern provinces, and who relied on Muslim eunuchs for many of his most sensitive diplomatic missions, understood perfectly well what he was commissioning when he selected the three-gem eunuch to lead the treasure fleet. The trilingual stele inscription that Zheng He erected at Galle in Sri Lanka in 1411, the same inscription that would be rediscovered by a British colonial official in 1911 and is now preserved in the National Museum of Colombo, praising the local Buddhist deity Tenavara Nayanar in Chinese, addressing the Hindu god Vishnu in Tamil, and offering devotion to Allah in Persian, is the most vivid surviving demonstration of the voyage's deliberate and systematic multicultural diplomacy. The same ceremonial act of piety directed simultaneously and with equal formality at three different religious traditions, each addressed in its own sacred language, by an admiral who could credibly represent all three to the different audiences he was simultaneously addressing. This was not cynicism or mere diplomatic performance. It was the sophisticated cultural intelligence of a man who had grown up at the intersection of Chinese, Islamic, and frontier Yunnanese civilization, and understood from the deepest personal experience that the divine truth each tradition pointed toward was not the exclusive property of any single tradition's institutional forms.
The biographical record of Zheng He is frustratingly incomplete, a direct consequence of the same systematic destruction and suppression of the voyage records that stripped away so much of what might otherwise have been known about the expeditions themselves and the men who conducted them. What survives is fragmentary in the specific way that official records destroyed by deliberate policy leave fragments. The stone steely inscriptions he personally commissioned and erected at various ports, which are among the most important primary documents of the voyages precisely because they survive outside the institutional archives that were subsequently purged. The accounts of the diarists who sailed with the fleet, particularly the interpreters Ma Huam, whose Yingya Shenglan, the overall survey of the ocean's shores, is the most detailed and reliable first-hand account of the places the voyages visited, and Fei Xin, whose Xingsha Shenglan, the overall survey of the star raft, covers a similar range. The later biographies compiled by Chinese scholars of the 15th and 16th centuries who were working from records that had already been partially destroyed and who therefore produced accounts that are incomplete in precisely the places where the institutional records were most thoroughly purged. And the oral traditions and architectural remains and place name memories scattered across the ports of the Indian Ocean world, from Malacca to Mombasa, that still 6 centuries after the last treasure ship sailed away, preserve traces of the Chinese visits in the specific forms that vernacular memory takes when official records are absent. In Malacca, there is a hill called Bukit China, China Hill, where the Chinese community established during the Yongle period built its cemetery, still used today. In Mozambique and Kenya, communities with traditions of Chinese ancestry have been studied by geneticists looking for the biological traces of the fleet's presence. In the National Museum of Colombo, the Galle stele stands in its glass case with its 3 columns of devotional text, the most extraordinary single artifact of the voyage's multicultural ambition. What emerges from these fragments and traces, when they are assembled with scholarly care, is a portrait of a man who was, above all and in everything the evidence reveals, supremely effective.
who accomplished difficult things repeatedly across a career of extraordinary duration and demand, who managed the competing pressures of imperial expectation, naval command, diplomatic protocol, personal faith, and institutional survival with a consistency and a quality of result that speaks to a character of genuine depth, discipline, and practical intelligence. He was not, so far as the sources reveal, a man of intellectual vanity or personal ambition in the conventional sense of those terms. He served the emperor he had been given as his master with complete loyalty across multiple reigns and changing political conditions. He honored the faith he had been born into with the discreet sincerity of a man for whom faith was a private resource rather than a public performance. He accomplished every mission assigned to him with the resources provided, and he returned across the same Indian Ocean 7 times in 30 years. He died in 1433 at approximately 62 years of age, probably at Calicut, the city of pepper and monsoons that he had visited on every voyage he commanded, and that represented the furthest western anchor of the Chinese maritime world. The Portuguese would arrive at Calicut 65 years after his death, in the same monsoon season, on the same trade winds. The greatest admiral in the history of the pre-modern world has no confirmed grave, only a cenotaph at Nusho Mountain near Nanjing, where the ocean cannot reach him.
Chapter 3. The Treasure Ships.
The treasure ships of Zheng He's fleet were, by any measure, the most ambitious maritime engineering achievement of the pre-modern world. Structures so far beyond the scale of anything built in any other tradition of the era that their very existence has been disputed by historians, unwilling to accept that the early 15th century could produce vessels of the size the Chinese records describe. The largest treasure ships, the flagships of the fleet, were recorded in the surviving sources as 440 chi long and 180 chi wide in the measurement standards of the early Ming period, approximately 137 meters in length and 56 meters in beam, with 9 masts and 4 full decks. These dimensions are extraordinary by any standard of pre-modern shipbuilding. For comparison, the largest European sailing warships of the early 19th century, the ships of the line that fought at Trafalgar, were approximately 70 meters in length. Columbus's Santa Maria was 19 meters. The Chinese treasure ships of 1405 were, if the records are accurate, larger than any vessel that would sail any ocean until the age of steam. Scholarly debate has circled these dimensions for decades, with some historians arguing that the figures given in the sources are exaggerated, perhaps by a factor of 2 or 3, reducing the ships to a still impressive but more structurally plausible 60-70 meters, while others maintain that the Chinese shipbuilding tradition, with its distinctive flat-bottomed hull form, its watertight compartmentalization, and its sophisticated rigging, was capable of producing vessels of the size described. The archaeological evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. At the Longjiang shipyard site near Nanjing, excavations have recovered an enormous wooden rudder post measuring approximately 11 meters, the largest pre-modern rudder post ever found anywhere in the world, which would be consistent with a vessel of the size the records describe. What is not in dispute is the fleet's organizational scale. 317 ships of various categories, 27,800 men, a floating civilization capable of months of independent operation in the Indian Ocean. Whether the flagship treasure ships were 80 meters or 130 meters long, they dwarfed anything else on any ocean of the world in 1405. And the impression they made on the port cities they visited, the rulers who saw these giants at anchor in their harbors and understood instantly that the civilization behind them was operating on a different order of magnitude than anything they had previously encountered, was one of deliberate, calculated awe. That awe was the point.
The treasure ships were not designed to carry cargo efficiently. They were designed to demonstrate power in a form that did not require a single cannon to be fired.
The technical achievements that made the treasure ships possible were the product of a Chinese maritime tradition with deep roots in the practical demands of commerce in the South China Sea, a body of water whose typhoon seasons, with winds reaching over 100 kilometers per hour, whose shallow coastal shells and coral reefs, and whose complex tidal patterns and seasonal monsoon reversals had been teaching Chinese shipbuilders and sailors the hard lessons of ocean survival since at least the Tang Dynasty, 7 centuries before the treasure fleet sailed. The compartmentalized hull, the single most important safety innovation in the entire history of pre-modern shipbuilding, more significant in its practical consequences for crew survival than any weapon system ever installed on a ship, had been in use in Chinese ocean-going vessels since at least the 11th century, as documented in Song Dynasty technical literature and confirmed by the archaeological examination of the Nanhai No. 01 wreck recovered from the South China Sea floor. The principle was elegant and decisive. The hull divided into separate watertight sections by internal transverse bulkheads running from the keel to the waterline, constructed in the flat-bottomed Chinese hull form that distributed the structural loads across the entire bottom rather than concentrating them in a single keel timber, so that a breach in any single section, from collision with a reef, from a cannonball, from the fatigue failure of a hull plank after months at sea, would flood only that section and would not cause the immediate cascading flooding and sinking that an equivalent breach would cause in a European hull of the same period. This innovation, which would not be adopted in European shipbuilding practice until the late 18th century, following its description by observers of Chinese vessels and its explicit advocacy by engineers including Benjamin Franklin and Marc Isambard Brunel, gave the treasure ships a resilience in collision and storm damage scenarios that no contemporary European vessel could approach. The battened lug sails, the distinctive Chinese sail form with horizontal bamboo battens running across each sail panel at regular intervals, allowed the sails to be reefed and unreefed with dramatically less labor and time than the European square sail systems of the period, critical advantages in the sudden squalls of the tropical Indian Ocean, where a sail that could not be shortened quickly in a storm gust would carry away its mast or capsize the vessel. The battened panels could also be rotated on their yard to catch wind from significantly different directions, giving the Chinese rig a capability to sail closer to the wind than square-rigged European vessels of the era. The magnetic compass had been in use for maritime navigation in China since the late Song Dynasty, and by the time of the treasure fleet, its application in Chinese navigation had been systematized into a 48-point bearing system that allowed navigators to specify course directions with considerable precision. Combined with timed runs at estimated speeds measured by log line, careful star altitude observations for latitude determination, and the detailed route charts of the Mao Kun map that recorded compass bearings, estimated distances, and water depths between the major ports of the Indian Ocean, the Chinese navigational system was sophisticated enough to move 27,000 men safely across 8,000 miles of open ocean and home again 7 times in 30 years without a single documented loss of a major vessel to navigational error. The crew of 27,800 men who sailed on the first voyage represented a carefully and deliberately selected cross-section of the specialized expertise required for a sustained diplomatic, military, and commercial mission operating on a global scale across 2 years and thousands of miles from any support base in China. The military complement, infantry soldiers trained in the crossbow and the halberd and the massed formation tactics of the Ming army, archers from the elite units of the Beijing garrison,
marine fighting men who could board and take a hostile vessel in harbor or open water, occupied the troop transports and the purpose-built warships that maintained station at the fleet's defensive perimeter. The visible iron fist that ensured the silk glove of Chinese diplomacy was taken seriously by every ruler who received it. The diplomatic staff included the senior eunuch officials of the Grand Director class, Wang Jinghong, Hung Bao, and the other high-ranking court officials who shared command of the fleet's diplomatic operations with Zheng He, who would conduct formal negotiations with foreign rulers in the elaborate protocols of the tribute system, present the Yongle emperor's sealed letters in their lacquered cases, receive the tribute missions that the system's enrolled states had prepared, and manage the gift exchange sequences that communicated the emperor's assessment of each ruler's status within the Chinese world order. The interpreters, among them the young Ma Huan, an educated Chinese Muslim whose Arabic and Persian were sufficiently accomplished for the formal registers of Islamic court diplomacy, were recruited from the maritime Muslim communities of Guangdong and Fujian, men who had grown up in the South China Sea trading world where multilingualism was a commercial necessity and whose languages included the Arabic and Persian that served as the diplomatic and commercial lingua francas of the Western Indian Ocean ports. The medical staff carried the full pharmacological repertoire of Song and Ming Dynasty Chinese medicine adapted to the specific pathology of the Indian Ocean environment, the malaria of the Malabar coast deltas, the typhoid of the crowded Southeast Asian port cities, the eye infections of the Arabian Peninsula's coast, supplemented by the practical experience of earlier Chinese maritime trading communities who had been dealing with these diseases for centuries. The craftsmen who maintained the fleet's operational capacity across voyages that lasted up to 2 years were specialists of exceptional skill. Shipwrights capable of diagnosing and repairing structural failures using timber obtained from local sources, caulkers and riggers who could restore a damaged hull or a carried-away spar within days, and sailmakers who could construct a replacement battened lug sail from raw material. And the farmers, the men who tended the herb and vegetable gardens installed on the upper weather decks of the large ships, were applying the accumulated agricultural knowledge of a civilization that had been growing food in controlled conditions for millennia to the specific nutritional challenge of long ocean voyaging. The combined food system preserved provisions from the supply ships, fresh produce from the shipboard gardens, and fresh food obtained at every major port was sophisticated enough to maintain 27,000 men in adequate health across months of open ocean. No European naval force would achieve comparable nutritional management until James Cook's voyages definitively demonstrated the connection between fresh food and the prevention of scurvy, 3 centuries after the Chinese had institutionalized the solution.
Chapter 4: Spices and Submission. The first 3 voyages of Zheng He, 1405 to 1407, 1407 to 1409, and 1409 to 1411, established the architectural framework of the tribute system across the entire arc of the Indian Ocean world, from Southeast Asia to the Arabian Peninsula, visiting in sequence the ports that formed the commercial and diplomatic spine of the ocean's trade. Champa, in what is now southern Vietnam, where the Cham Kingdom maintained a lucrative middleman position in the South China Sea trade, and whose ruler had long experience of managing relationships with the Chinese Colossus to the north. Java, the most populous and agriculturally productive island of the Indonesian archipelago, whose Hindu-Buddhist rulers were still navigating the transition to the Islamic trading networks that would eventually transform the island's religious landscape entirely within a generation.
Sumatra, whose ports controlled access to the Malacca Strait and whose pepper and camphor and benzoin resin made it one of the most commercially valuable territories in the region. And Calicut on the Malabar coast of India, the premier spice market of the Indian Ocean world, and the city where the most important pepper and ginger and cardamom of the Asian trade was loaded onto Arab and Indian dhows for the westward journey across the Arabian Sea to Hormuz and Aden, and ultimately to the markets of the Mediterranean. The Zamarin of Calicut, the Hindu ruler whose family had controlled this trade entrepot for generations, received Zheng He's fleet with the cautious hospitality of a ruler who understood that the Chinese ships represented a power quite unlike anything he had previously encountered, and who calculated quickly that the tributary relationship the Chinese proposed was commercially advantageous rather than genuinely subordinating. The commercial logic of these early voyages was structured around a fundamental asymmetry that gave China an almost insuperable diplomatic advantage. The tribute system required foreign rulers to send periodic missions to Beijing, carrying symbolic gifts, exotic animals, rare local products, a formal letter acknowledging the emperor's theoretical suzerainty. And China returned those missions with gifts of silk, porcelain, and bronze goods of a value that consistently and deliberately exceeded what had been brought in tribute. China was effectively subsidizing the political loyalty of the tribute system's participants at a rate that reflected the immense surplus productive capacity of the Ming agricultural heartland and the specific political ambitions of an emperor who wanted the theater of universal acknowledgement more than commercial profit from the Indian Ocean's trade. For the rulers of the port cities from Champa to Calicut, the calculation was entirely straightforward. Accept Chinese suzerainty in the ritual form of periodic tribute missions, receive Chinese gifts and Chinese diplomatic protection in return, and watch the commercial access to the Chinese imperial market that the tributary relationship authorized generate wealth far beyond what had been brought in tribute. The system worked because it was, in its practical operation, genuinely beneficial to everyone it enrolled, including the Arab, Indian, Malay, and Swahili merchants of every nationality who sailed in the commercial shadow of the tributary relationship and conducted the actual trade in black pepper and nutmeg and clothes and silk and porcelain and cotton and horses and the hundreds of other commodities that circulated through the Indian Ocean's vast and ancient commercial networks. The Chinese were not displacing an existing trading system. They were inserting the prestige of their state power into one that had operated for centuries without it, and finding that the system's participants were generally willing to include Chinese state power in their calculations if the price was right, and the price China was offering was very good indeed.
The diplomatic gifts that Zheng He distributed to tributary rulers were selected with the specific attention to local preferences and status hierarchies that only an intelligence network of considerable sophistication could have assembled and maintained over the decades of the voyage's operation. Silk, the quintessential Chinese luxury, technically complex to produce and impossible to replicate anywhere in the world at the quality level of the imperial workshops of Suzhou and Hangzhou, was the primary medium of Chinese soft power, graded in quality and quantity to precisely match the status the emperor wished to assign each recipient. The highest grade imperial silk went to the rulers who held the most strategically valuable positions in the Indian Ocean trading world, the lesser grades to their subordinate officials and allies, the calibration exact enough to communicate diplomatic rankings without a word needing to be said. Porcelain, blue and white, celadon, the distinctive products of Jingdezhen kilns in Jiangxi province that were already the technical wonder of the ceramic world, traveled in the holds of the treasure ships as diplomatic gifts and as commercial cargo alike, packed in straw and sawdust in the watertight lower holds that gave the Chinese vessels their technological advantage. And its distribution transformed the material culture of every port the fleet visited in ways that archaeologists are still documenting 6 centuries later. 15th century Chinese porcelain fragments recovered from every major coastal site in the Indian Ocean world, from the Swahili city-states of Mombasa and Malindi to the trading ports of Arabia and the palace sites of India, constitute the most durable material record of the treasure fleet's reach, more reliable than any written account and impossible to dispute as physical evidence of contact. Tea and copper cash and iron goods accompany the silk and porcelain in the outward cargo, creating commercial flows that local merchants and rulers built their own enterprises around, the Chinese goods becoming the premium currency of Indian Ocean luxury exchange for the duration of the voyages and for generations afterward. What returned to China, the tribute that the voyages were nominally organized to collect, and the commercial cargo that was their practical and economic substance, included everything the extraordinary Indian Ocean world produced in its vast abundance. Black pepper from the Malabar coast in quantities measured in tens of thousands of catties per voyage, sufficient to supply the entire Chinese imperial kitchen and the requirements of the court pharmacopoeia, and still leave sufficient for distribution to the merchants who financed the voyage's commercial dimensions. Cloves and nutmeg from the Banda Islands, tiny volcanic specks in the eastern Indonesian archipelago, whose products were the most valuable commodities on Earth by weight in any market from Canton to Cairo. Cinnamon from Ceylon, frankincense and myrrh from the Dhofar coast of Arabia, the same resins that had been traded north to the Mediterranean since the time of the ancient Egyptians. Coral and pearls from the Persian Gulf beds worked by divers whose skills were already legendary across the Indian Ocean world. Horses from the Arabian Peninsula, whose bloodlines the Yongle Emperor wanted for his cavalry operations on the northern frontier. Ivory and gold and ambergris from the East African coast, whose Swahili merchants had organized the trade routes into the African interior for centuries. And the extraordinary zoological ambassadors, lions and leopards and ostriches and zebras, and most spectacularly the giraffe from Malindi that the court scholars identified with the legendary qilin, that equatorial Africa and Arabia sent to astonish the court of Beijing and demonstrate to any observer of the emperor receiving them the truly global reach of a tributary system that extended to the far edge of the world the Chinese maps described.
Chapter 5. The Shores of Africa.
The middle voyages, the fourth from 1413 to 1415, the fifth from 1416 to 1419, and the sixth from 1421 to 1422, expanded the geographical reach of the treasure fleet systematically westward along the Indian Ocean's northern arc, from the familiar Southeast Asian ports to the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and finally the coral-walled city-states of the East African coast, completing the full circuit of the ocean that Chinese maritime knowledge had been accumulating for centuries but had never before projected organized state power across on this scale. The fourth voyage was the first to reach Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, a trading entrepot of legendary wealth, whose Omani Arab and Persian merchants handled the entire commerce flowing between India and Persia, and whose position at the Gulf's narrow entrance made it indispensable to any power that wished to claim meaningful influence over the Arabian Sea's commercial networks. The city of Hormuz in the early 15th century was a place where merchants from every civilization between Venice and Canton traded simultaneously, Arab dhows, and Indian vessels sharing anchorage, with the occasional Venetian agent buying spices for the European market. And the arrival of the Chinese treasure fleet, with its flagship vessels dwarfing every other ship in the harbor by a factor that made comparison almost absurd, must have communicated the scale of Ming China's maritime ambition with an immediacy that no diplomatic letter could have matched. Aden, at the entrance to the Red Sea, occupied a position in the Western Indian Ocean trade that made Hormuz look almost peripheral, the single port through which all commerce between India and the Mediterranean must necessarily pass. Its position on the narrow strait between the Arabian Peninsula and the mountains of the Horn of Africa, giving its ruling sultan a control over the east-west trade flow that translated into mercantile wealth of a genuinely extraordinary order. The Arab trading cities of Dhofar and Shir in southern Oman, whose hinterland was the source of the frankincense and myrrh that had been flowing north toward the Mediterranean's temples and markets since the time of the ancient Egyptians and the pharaonic spice trade, received Chinese diplomatic missions with the enthusiasm of rulers who understood that the largest naval force in the Indian Ocean was offering them recognition rather than demanding it. Beyond Aden, along the East African coast, the Swahili city-states of Mogadishu, Brava, Malindi, and Mombasa that Ibn Battuta had visited and admired 2 generations earlier, describing their wealth and the sophistication of their coral and lime architecture, were drawn into the tribute system with a ceremonious enthusiasm that reflected the genuine and concrete advantage they saw in Chinese recognition and Chinese commercial connection. These were not large polities in the sense that Java or India were large. They were trading cities of a few thousand inhabitants each, built on the coral reefs of the East African coast, prosperous from their middleman position in the trade between the African interior and the broader Indian Ocean world, and perpetually vulnerable to the ambitions of larger powers on the Arabian Peninsula, who might decide that controlling these entrepôts directly was preferable to trading through them. The diplomatic missions that Mogadishu and Malindi and Mombasa sent to Beijing, missions that arrived in the Chinese capital with exotic African animals and aromatic goods, and formal letters acknowledging the emperor's theoretical suzerainty, were received with the full theater of the tribute ritual, the foreign ambassadors prostrating before the dragon throne in the ceremonial sequence that acknowledged the Chinese emperor as the center of the world order. The right to trade within the Chinese market system and the Chinese protection that the tributary relationship implied against any regional power that might threaten a small coastal city-state were benefits concrete and specific enough to justify the ritual theater of submission that the system required.
The most celebrated single diplomatic achievement of all 7 voyages arrived aboard the fleet returning from the East African coast in 1415, a giraffe sent by the ruler of Malindi as tribute, which the court interpreters identified with the qilin, the mythical composite creature of Chinese tradition, whose appearance in the world was understood as a direct celestial confirmation of the reigning emperor's moral virtue and cosmic legitimacy. The qilin was not merely a lucky omen in the conventional sense that a rabbit or a crane might be auspicious. It was a specific and powerful theological statement about the moral quality of the reign it appeared in, a creature whose presence in the living world was only possible when the emperor's virtue had created the conditions of perfect cosmic harmony that allowed such miraculous things to manifest from the spiritual realm into the physical one. The identification of an East African giraffe with the qilin was, in retrospect, a piece of diplomatic theater of the highest sophistication, and one whose precise origins of interpretation remain genuinely uncertain. Whether the Malindi court,
through the sophisticated diplomacy of experienced Indian Ocean traders who had received Chinese visits before and understood Chinese symbolic systems well, chose the giraffe precisely because they understood its potential identification with the qilin, or whether the Chinese court scholars constructed the interpretation themselves from the creature's utterly otherworldly physical characteristics, its extraordinary height, its mosaic-patterned hide, its peaceful herbivorous nature, its silent dignity. The effect was identical and the political consequence immense. The Yongle emperor appeared in the outer courtyard of the Forbidden City to receive the giraffe in person, an act of personal condescension from the Son of Heaven to the tribute arriving from the far edge of the world that was itself a powerful statement of the emperor's cosmic confidence. The court prostrated in the formal ceremony of acknowledgement, the painters commissioned to record the scene, producing images that survive as some of the most extraordinary artifacts of the entire treasure fleet enterprise. An impossibly tall, spotted African animal standing in a Chinese imperial courtyard, tended by its East African handler in the embroidered dress of the Swahili coast, the lacquered gates and yellow-tiled towers of the Forbidden City rising implausibly behind it, the Beijing sky providing a backdrop that no artist could have imagined from any combination of Chinese and African visual traditions separately. The painting is simultaneously a document of genuine historical strangeness, Africa and China meeting in a moment no previous century could have produced, and a demonstration of the treasure fleet's most fundamental accomplishment, the ability to make the Emperor of China and the rulers of the East African coast relevant to each other's political and symbolic calculations. The fleet operations of the middle voyages were organized on a scale that reflected the enormous logistical infrastructure the imperial treasury was sustaining across multiple simultaneous expeditions. Dozens of ships, thousands of men, months-long provisioning operations at multiple ports, the maintenance and renewal of the diplomatic relationships established by the first 3 voyages, and the systematic extension of those relationships to new ports whose rulers had heard of the great ships and were eager to be included in the tributary network that the Chinese were building across the full circuit of the Indian Ocean. The 5th voyage, which reached East Africa in 1417, returned with ambassadors from no fewer than 19 tributary states traveling together to Beijing, a demonstration of the tribute system's breadth that served the Yongle Emperor's political purposes as no military campaign could have done.
Chapter 6: The Farthest Horizon. The 7th and final voyage, which departed China in the winter of 1431 and returned in the summer of 1433, was in every measurable dimension the greatest of the 7, the largest fleet, the longest duration, the greatest geographical reach, and the most elaborate and operationally complex diplomatic program of any single expedition in the history of the treasure voyages. More than 100 ships, with crews numbering in the tens of thousands, assembled at the Fujian ports of Guangzhou and Fuzhou in the months before departure. The fleet organized with the full sophistication of 30 years of accumulated institutional knowledge about how to move an army across an ocean and maintain it in operational effectiveness for 2 years far from home. The departure in January 1431 was accompanied by the Tianfei prayers that Zheng He had performed before every voyage, the Muslim admiral at the sea goddess altar, the fleet's Muslim members preparing mentally for the possibility of reaching Mecca's port at Jeddah, the Buddhist and Confucian officers performing their own devotions to the deities who protected sailors from the storms of the Indian Ocean. The route by this 7th voyage was as familiar to the fleet's navigators as a highway, down the Vietnamese coast past Champa, through the Java Sea past the ports of the Indonesian archipelago, across the Bay of Bengal to Ceylon and the Malabar coast,
and then the long westward run across the Arabian Sea to Hormuz. The fleet reached Hormuz in the summer of 1432, and from Hormuz dispatched sub-squadrons in the operational pattern that the middle voyages had established. Separate squadrons proceeding simultaneously to the Red Sea ports of Aden and Jeddah, to the Arabian Peninsula's southern coast at Dhofar, and down the East African coast as far south as the Swahili city-states of the Kenya and Tanzania coasts. The operational sophistication of this simultaneous multi-directional deployment, coordinating separate squadrons across thousands of miles of ocean without radio communication, relying on the monsoon calendar and the accumulated knowledge of 30 years of Indian Ocean operation, was the highest expression of Chinese naval administrative capacity in the age of sail. The sub-squadrons that proceeded down the East African coast pushed further south than any previous voyage had explicitly documented, reaching ports that the fragmentary surviving records suggest may have been as far south as Mozambique or the northern approaches to the island of Madagascar, the southmost extent of any Chinese maritime presence in the Indian Ocean world, achieved in the same decade that Portuguese explorers, working their way incrementally down the West African coast in the entirely separate tradition of Henrichian maritime expansion, were approaching the same latitudes from the direction of the Atlantic. Had both programs continued at the rates they were advancing, they would have converged on the Cape of Good Hope within a single generation, a counterfactual whose implications for the subsequent history of world civilization are genuinely difficult to overstate. The Islamic pilgrimage connection that had been implicit in the voyages from the beginning was particularly visible in the seventh voyage's Red Sea operations. Muslim members of the fleet's crew, a substantial proportion, drawn from the maritime Muslim communities of Fujian and Guangdong that had been part of the Indian Ocean trading world since the Tang dynasty, were granted permission to make the Hajj from Jeddah while the fleet was in Arabian waters. Several hundred men of the treasure fleet performed the pilgrimage in the Hajj season of 1432, walking the same routes around the Kaaba that Zheng He's own grandfather had walked, connecting the Chinese imperial expedition to the oldest and most universal of Islamic institutions in a way that made the fleet's presence in every Islamic port from Aden to Mombasa something other than the merely diplomatic or commercial.
The death of Zheng He in 1433 closed the era of the treasure voyages in the most personal of terms. The admiral who had commanded 4 of the 7 expeditions, who had built the diplomatic network that spanned more than 30 countries across the full circuit of the Indian Ocean world, who had spent more of his adult life at sea or in foreign ports than in China, died during the homeward passage of the 7th voyage, most probably at Calicut, the premier spice port of the Malabar coast that he had visited on every voyage he personally commanded, the city whose name appears in the Chinese voyage records more frequently than any other port in the western Indian Ocean, the city where he had built a warehouse complex and maintained permanent diplomatic staff, the city that was in every meaningful sense the western headquarters of the treasure fleet enterprise. He was approximately 62 years old, an age that in the 15th century represented a life fully used and a career fully realized. The monsoon winds of the Arabian Sea, the coral ports of East Africa, the pepper warehouses of Calicut, the Persian Gulf's turquoise waters, the Javanese harbors dense with the smell of cloves and nutmeg, these had been his world for 3 decades, more familiar to him than the China he had left as a child captive from Yunnan.
whether his body was buried at sea, committed to the ocean that had been the medium of his life's work and the substance of his worldly greatness, or whether his remains were carried back to China in the fleet that continued home without him, is a question that the surviving sources dispute without resolving. A cenotaph at Miushou Mountain, south of Nanjing, is his monument, a graceful structure that acknowledges the greatness it marks while being honest, in the physical absence of remains, about the limits of what mortal memorials can contain. The Islamic tradition of burial at sea for those who die on ocean voyages would have been known to him from his family's religious practice and from the deaths of Muslim crewmen on previous voyages. The Chinese tradition of returning the honored dead to home soil for the proper rituals of interment and ancestral veneration was equally present in his formation. Which tradition governed his end, no surviving document definitively confirms, and the silence on the question feels somehow appropriate for a man who spent his life navigating between traditions rather than anchoring himself in any single one. The diplomatic network he had built across 30 years of sustained effort, 30-plus tributary states from the Ryukyu Islands to the Swahili coast, hundreds of individual diplomatic relationships maintained through the periodic exchange of missions and gifts and letters, the commercial infrastructure of the tribute system with its warehouses and resident interpreters and established protocols for the handling of foreign envoys, did not survive him in the institutional form he had given it, because the political conditions that had made the voyages possible were already dissolving before the seventh voyage had even departed from the Fujian ports. The Yongle Emperor, who had been the voyage's essential sponsor and political engine, without whose will and authority the entire enterprise was inconceivable, had died in 1924, 9 years before the last fleet returned to China. His immediate successor, the Hongxi Emperor, had halted the voyages within months of ascending the throne and issued edicts that reversed the maritime policy of the previous 2 decades with a decisiveness that left no room for misreading the new court's intentions. The Xuande Emperor had authorized the seventh voyage as a diplomatic obligation. The tribute relationships accumulated across 30 years could not simply be abandoned without consequences to Chinese prestige across the Indian Ocean world, but over explicit official objections that would have been imaginable to raise in the Yongle period. When the Seventh Fleet came home to the Fujian ports in the summer of 1433, without the admiral who had commanded it, there was no political force in the court capable of arguing persuasively for an 8th voyage, and no imperial patron willing to override the Confucian majority that had finally, after 30 decades of sustained opposition, captured the direction of maritime policy. The ocean highway that the treasure ships had spent 30 years building across the Indian Ocean, the tributary network, the accumulated navigational knowledge, the institutional expertise, the web of diplomatic relationships and commercial agreements, was left to dissolve behind them, unmaintained and eventually forgotten. And the world they had touched with such extraordinary purposefulness would not encounter Chinese state power at sea again for 5 centuries.
Chapter 7. The Burning of the Records. The political battle between the eunuch maritime faction and the Confucian scholar official faction that determined the fate of the treasure fleet voyages was one of the most consequential ideological conflicts in Chinese history, and one of the most asymmetric in its structural terms. The eunuchs who organized and commanded the voyages were dependent on imperial favor for literally everything: their status, their income, their institutional position, their physical safety, while the Confucian officials who opposed them were the permanent civil service of the Ming state,
holding office across multiple reigns, trained in the same intellectual tradition that had governed Chinese society for 1,000 years, networked through the same examination system whose graduates formed a coherent class regardless of the specific emperor they served under. A eunuch faction without imperial protection was nothing. A Confucian scholar official faction without imperial protection was inconvenienced but still existed, still held office through the bureaucratic structures that no emperor could entirely abolish without destroying the administrative machinery of the state itself. The Confucian opposition to the voyages was not merely institutional self-interest, though institutional self-interest was certainly present, since the voyages enriched and empowered the eunuchs at the expense of the regular bureaucracy's budget and influence. The opposition was also ideological, rooted in a genuine and coherent Confucian political philosophy that saw the maritime enterprise as a fundamental category error. The emperor's role was to govern the agricultural heartland properly, not to seek tribute from distant barbarians at enormous expense. The state's resources should be spent on the northern frontier against the Mongol remnants who were an actual military threat, not on diplomatic theater in the Indian Ocean. The social hierarchy that placed scholars above merchants and farmers above sailors reflected the correct moral order of civilization, and the voyages inverted that hierarchy in ways that were corrupting to the social fabric. The Yongle Emperor's death in 1424 was the turning point at which these arguments ceased to be the losing side of a court debate and became the governing policy of the state. His successor, the Hongxi Emperor, a man whose disposition was toward classical Confucian governance and whose relationship with his father had been one of sustained tension over precisely the question of the maritime enterprise's cost and purpose, halted the voyages within months of ascending the throne. The edict was immediate, clear, and unmistakable in its signal of the new political balance. No new ships to be built for ocean voyages, the treasure fleet to be maintained but not expanded, the overseas trade operations to be wound down. The Hongxi Emperor died within a year of these edicts, and the Xuande Emperor who followed him authorized one final voyage, the seventh, as a gesture toward the diplomatic obligations the tribute relationships had created and could not simply be abandoned without consequences to Chinese prestige across 30 tributary states. But when the seventh voyage returned in 1433 and Zheng He's death removed the one figure who might have argued successfully for an eighth, the political environment had shifted with a definitiveness that no court faction could reverse. The Xuande Emperor's death in 1435 and the succession of a child emperor governed by a regency entirely dominated by Confucian officials completed the transition. The maritime faction without an imperial patron and without Zheng He had no institutional ground on which to stand. The voyages were not merely cancelled, they were systematically erased from the accessible historical record, the machinery of erasure being the specific and deliberate destruction or concealment of the voyage documents that might have served as arguments for resumption.
The destruction of the treasure fleet records, one of the great deliberate acts of historical erasure in the pre-modern world, comparable in its consequences for our knowledge of the past to the burning of the Library of Alexandria or the destruction of the Aztec codices by Finca missionaries, was accomplished not in a single catastrophic burning, but in a process of gradual attrition and active suppression that played out over several decades, its most significant single act attributed to Lao Daxia, the Vice Minister of War, sometime in the 1470s or 1480s, more than 40 years after the last voyage returned. The episode is documented in a later source when a court official requested access to the voyage records in connection with a renewed proposal to resume maritime activity on the Indian Ocean. Laodicea reportedly removed the relevant documents from the imperial archives before they could be located and provided, either burning them in the straightforward act of destruction the sources suggest, or concealing them in a location that has never in the subsequent 5 centuries been discovered. His justification, as recorded, was explicit and argued from Confucian principle rather than personal malice. The voyages had been extravagant wastes of imperial resources that had produced no defensible benefit to the Chinese state or people, and making the navigational charts and operational records available to officials who might use them to argue for resumption would simply enable the waste to be repeated. The act was presented not as censorship or historical vandalism, but as the responsible governance of a Confucian official protecting the state's resources from the renewed enthusiasm of factions who had demonstrably not learned the lessons that the previous century's experience had made available to anyone willing to read them correctly. Whether Laodicea burned the records or merely made them inaccessible through concealment, the practical effect was identical and the historical consequence irreversible. The detailed navigational charts of the Indian Ocean routes, the diplomatic correspondence with 30-plus tributary states, the ship design specifications for the treasure ship classes, the route books and tidal atlases of the Indian Ocean compiled over 3 decades of systematic observation, and the operational records of 7 large fleet campaigns across the breadth of the world's greatest ocean. All of this was removed from the accessible archive and effectively destroyed as a resource for any future maritime enterprise. What survived, the stone-steel inscriptions that Zheng He had erected at Galei and Chinese coastal sites, the accounts of the diarists Ma Huan and Fei Xin and Geng Zhen, whose literary works had circulated beyond the institutional archive, the fragments of information preserved in later military encyclopedias and geographical compilations by scholars who had seen the original records before their suppression, survived accidentally as residue rather than record. The Heijin maritime prohibition was reinforced and its penalties increased. Imperial edicts restricted the construction of vessels with more than 2 masts, making ocean-going trade a criminal offense and reducing the Chinese maritime tradition to coastal fishing and the shallow water trade with Japan and Korea. Within a single generation after the last voyage, the shipwrights who had designed and built the 9-masted treasure ships were dead of old age, and their apprentices had spent their careers building fishing junks rather than ocean flagships. The techniques for constructing vessels of the treasure ship's scale, the timber selection, the hull form calculations, the compartmentalization engineering, the mast step design, were knowledge that existed in human minds, and when those minds were gone, the knowledge was gone with them.
Chapter 8. What Might Have Been. The physical evidence that survives from the treasure fleet enterprise is fragmentary but geographically extensive, and taken together, sufficient to confirm the broad outlines of what the surviving records describe, and to sustain, in the minds of archaeologists and historians working across a dozen countries on 3 continents, the sense of a civilization whose maritime achievement has not yet been fully mapped or measured. The Longjiang shipyard site at Nanjing, where excavations conducted intermittently since the 1950s by archaeologists from Nanjing University and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, have uncovered the dry dock basin outlines, timber storage pits, workshop foundations, and administrative building remains of the Ming-era construction facility, has produced the single most dramatic physical artifact of the entire treasure fleet enterprise. A wooden rudder post of extraordinary dimensions, approximately 11 meters in length and correspondingly massive in cross-section, recovered from the site's anaerobic waterlogged layers where the absence of oxygen had preserved it through 6 centuries of burial. The artifact is now displayed in a purpose-built museum that occupies part of the original shipyard footprint along the Yangtze Bank, its scale communicated to visitors by the human figures that stand beside it.
No other pre-modern rudder post of comparable dimensions has been found at any site anywhere in the world. Its size is consistent with a vessel requiring a rudder of the scale the treasure ship descriptions imply, and its survival, an object whose practical function demanded exactly the massive, high-density timber that could endure both the mechanical stresses of ocean navigation and 6 centuries of waterlogged burial, constitutes one of the strongest single pieces of physical evidence for the scale of the Longjiang operation and, by implication, for the scale of the vessels it built. Across the Indian Ocean world, the material evidence accumulates at every site where archaeologists have looked. 15th century Chinese blue and white porcelain sherds recovered from the palace excavations at Kilwa Kisiwani in Tanzania, from the waterfront deposits of Mombasa and Malindi, from the archaeological layers of Hormuz and Aden and Calicut. The same porcelain forms appearing at sites separated by thousands of miles of ocean, each fragment a silent testament to the fleet's physical presence at that location. The galley stele inscription in Sri Lanka, erected by Zheng He's deputy Wang Jinghong during the third voyage in 1411, is the most important surviving textual document of the voyages in the admiral's own institutional voice. The stone recording the official purpose of the expeditions, the divine protections invoked for safe passage, and the material offerings made to the Buddhist deity of the Galley headland. Its 3 columns of text in Chinese, Tamil, and Persian, addressing 3 different divinities in 3 different religious traditions in the same act of ceremonial devotion, remain uniquely moving as a document of a civilization that could project power across the entire Indian Ocean world and still take the organizational trouble to address every culture it encountered in its own sacred language, by name, with appropriate theological precision. Museums in Malacca, Nanjing, and Xi'an preserve the accumulated material fragments of the voyages, the porcelain sherds and bronze coins recovered from Indian Ocean archaeological sites, the names and military ranks and home districts of the fleet's officers preserved in the epitaphs and memorial stele inscriptions that their families erected after their deaths. The partial navigational record, reconstructed from surviving manuscript copies of the Mao Kun strip map that charts the Indian Ocean routes in the characteristic Chinese format of a continuous horizontal scroll, recording coastline features, compass bearings, and estimated distances from port to port across the full extent of the ocean the fleet navigated.
The counterfactual question at the heart of the treasure fleet story: what would have happened if China had continued its maritime enterprise instead of withdrawing from the ocean, is one of the most consequential thought experiments in the history of world civilization, and one that historians have been engaging with increasing sophistication and specificity since the voyages became the subject of serious Western scholarly attention in the final decades of the 20th century, beginning with the Chinese studies of the 1970s and expanding through the comparative maritime history scholarship of Geneviève Bouchon, K.N. Chowdhury, Roderick Ptak, and the generation of scholars they trained. The timeline of what actually happened is the necessary and sobering starting point for any such speculation. The last treasure voyage returned to the Fujian ports in the summer of 1433. Bartolomeu Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. Vasco da Gama reached Calicut, Zheng He's Calicut, the city where the great admiral had died 65 years earlier in 1498, completing the first direct sea route between Europe and the Indian Ocean spice trade that the Portuguese had been working toward for half a century of systematic coastal exploration. Columbus, sailing in 1492 on the basis of a geographical miscalculation that placed Asia far closer to Europe than it actually was, reached the Caribbean and believed until his death that he had found the outer islands of Asia.
The Portuguese and Spanish maritime enterprises that would transform the world's political and commercial geography across the 16th century began in the most striking terms within a single human lifetime of the last treasure voyage, and began into an Indian Ocean that the treasure voyages had spent 30 years organizing into a Chinese tributary system. Had the Chinese voyages continued at the pace and scale of the 7th, the Portuguese caravels arriving at the East African coast in the 1490s would have encountered an ocean already organized under a power of naval strength and diplomatic infrastructure incomparably greater than anything their small wooden ships with their crews of 150 men could have contested. Whether that confrontation would have prevented the subsequent transformation of the Indian Ocean into a European-dominated commercial system, or merely altered its timing and character and altered the distribution of its profits, is genuinely unknowable. The forces driving European maritime expansion were deeply rooted in the economic and demographic and political conditions of early modern Europe, conditions that the presence of Chinese ships in the Indian Ocean would not easily have deflected. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the world would have looked different. The Swahili city-states of East Africa that Portuguese warships bombarded into submission and tributary payment between 1502 and 1510 might have survived under Chinese diplomatic protection. The spice trade of the Banda Islands and the Malabar coast that became the foundation of the Portuguese Estado da India and subsequently of Dutch and English colonial fortunes might have remained in Asian commercial hands for a generation or two longer, and the trajectory of the subsequent centuries might have been shaped by a more complex and competitive set of maritime powers rather than by the European expansion that the Chinese withdrawal made possible. Modern China has found in Zheng He a figure of enormous symbolic importance for its 21st century self-understanding as a rising maritime power with a historical tradition of peaceful commercial engagement rather than military conquest. The official framing of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road concept owes an explicit and sometimes historically strained debt to the treasure fleet legacy that is visible in every official Chinese discussion of the voyages. Whether the historical Zheng He and his voyages deserve quite the symbolic weight that contemporary Chinese nationalism and strategic communication have placed on them is a question historians continue to engage with appropriate caution. But the voyage's genuine achievement, the largest and most organizationally sophisticated maritime enterprise in the pre-modern world, conducted across 3 decades with a consistency and ambition and competence that has no parallel in any other civilization of the era, requires no political amplification, no national myth-making, no strategic instrumentalization to be, on its own historical terms, extraordinary beyond easy description.